In 1997, Oklahoma City police knocked on private doors and confiscated a film that had won the Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Film. Not drugs, not weapons. A movie. The Supreme Court eventually overturned the seizure. The police had already been inside people's homes. Subscribe before we start. Every film today was considered dangerous enough to justify exactly that. Governments ban films for two reasons. The reason they announce, and the reason they don't. Today's list is films that crossed both lines simultaneously. Sex and violence as political acts. Bodies as arguments. The last filmmaker tonight was prosecuted by his own government 3 times, acquitted 3 times, and murdered before his 4th film in the series could be completed. Immoral Tales, 1974. Directed by Walerian Boroksyk. 4 stories across 4 centuries. A medieval countess bathing in the blood of virgin girls. A Renaissance noblewoman's relationship with a cucumber. A young woman's first encounter with desire. And a papal orgy conducted by Lucrezia Borgia. Walerian Boroksyk made Immoral Tales for Argos Films in France, and released it through the European art house circuit before it entered international distribution through channels that the film's content had made complicated in every territory it reached. Boroksyk was a Polish animator, who had been making formally sophisticated short films since the 1950s, work that had received serious critical attention across Europe, and that the French production infrastructure had provided the resources to expand into features. Immoral Tales represented his first fully explicit feature, and the specific combination he had assembled: historical subject matter, art cinema, visual intelligence, and content that the censorship frameworks of multiple countries had developed instruments to suppress. Produced a film that the Italian censorship board banned outright, that the Australian classification board refused to certify, and that the British Board of Film Censors passed in a cut version that removed approximately 12 minutes of footage Boroksyk considered essential to the film's argument. The argument, as Boroksyk described it in interviews, was that desire was the one constant across human history that every civilization had attempted to suppress, and none had succeeded in suppressing. The censorship boards that cut his film provided the most efficient possible confirmation of his thesis. A sequence depicting Countess Erzsébet B. Thory, who historically murdered between 80 and 650 young women, and bathed in their blood in the belief it would preserve her youth, was passed by the French censorship board without cuts, while being banned in its entirety by the Italian board. The identical footage received opposite regulatory responses in 2 neighboring countries in the same year, which is either a statement about the relative sophistication of French and Italian censorship frameworks, or a statement about the complete arbitrariness of both. Immoral Tales has been released through Cult Epics in a restoration presenting the complete uncut version. Walerian Boroksyk continued making films until his death in 2006. The Italian ban was eventually lifted. The 12 minutes the British board removed have been restored in all subsequent home video releases. The censorship boards that made the original determinations have never explained the specific reasoning behind them. Immoral Tales used history as its alibi, and found that history was insufficient protection. The story of O used anonymity as its alibi, published under a pseudonym, filmed under a pseudonym, its actual author unknown for 20 years, and found that anonymity was equally insufficient when the content was specific enough. The Story of O 1975, directed by Just Jekin. A French woman named O enters a chateau at Rossi, at her lover's request, and submits to a regime of bondage, discipline, and the systematic transfer of her ownership between men, and the film that Just Jekin made from Pauline R. Age's 1954 novel, was banned in Germany, Sweden, Norway, and Australia before its first year of international release was complete. Just Jekin had directed Emmanuelle the previous year, a film whose commercial success had established that explicit erotic content could achieve mainstream theatrical distribution if the production values were sufficiently elevated. The Story of O applied the same production logic to source material that Emmanuelle had not approached. A novel whose specific content, published in France in 1954 under a pseudonym, had been generating obscenity prosecutions and censorship proceedings across Europe for 20 years before the film adaptation arrived to generate a new set of proceedings. Corinne Ciel-Rai plays O with the specific quality of a performance built around submission as an active rather than a passive state, a formal decision that the film's defenders cited as its central artistic achievement, and that the censorship boards that banned it cited as its primary offense, the willing participation of the film's subject in her own objectification being more rather than less disturbing to the regulatory framework than coercion would have been. The chateau setting, shot in actual French locations with a production design that treated the material with the formal seriousness of a costume drama, gave the film a visual environment that the exploitation circuit's conventional aesthetic could not have provided. The shock element, Pauline R. Age, the pseudonymous author of the original novel, was revealed in 1994 to be Dominique Ory, a respected French literary editor and member of the Académie Française reading committee. She had written the novel in 1954 as a series of love letters to her partner Jean-Paul Hahn, never expecting publication. She was 87 years old when she confirmed her identity publicly. The novel that had been prosecuted for obscenity across Europe for 40 years had been written by one of France's most respected literary figures as a private act of romantic correspondence. The Story of O has been released through various home video labels. The German ban lasted until 1990. Just Jekin made Emmanuelle in America with Joe D'Amato the following year. Dominique Ory died in 1998. The chateau where the film was shot is a private residence.
Themroc! Themroc!
Themroc 1973. Directed by Claude Faraldo. A Parisian factory worker named Themroc returns home from work, seals himself inside his apartment, breaks through the wall to create a cave, commits incest with his sister, eats a policeman, and invites the neighborhood to join him. And Claude Faraldo shot this in actual Paris locations, with a cast that included Michel Piccoli, and spent approximately no money on a film that the Italian censorship board banned. The German censorship board restricted, and the British Board of Film Censors passed with cuts that removed the cannibalism sequence entirely. Faraldo constructed Themroc around a formal decision so specific, it is worth stating precisely. No character in the film speaks a comprehensible word of any language. Every line of dialogue is delivered in an invented grunt. Language that the film provides no subtitles for, and no translation of. The argument is not delivered through dialogue but through action. Themroc's regression from industrial worker to cave, dwelling primitive, is the film's thesis about what civilization costs the people it is built on, and the thesis is presented without the mediation of language, because Faraldo had decided that language was the primary instrument through which civilization maintained the compliance of the people it exploited. Michel Piccoli plays Themroc with the physical commitment of a major French actor who had decided that the role's requirements, the nudity, the regression, the cannibalism, were extensions of what serious acting had always required, and that the production's minimal budget was the honest context in which to deliver them. The shock element. The Italian censorship board banned Themroc in 1973. specifically citing the incest sequence as the grounds for the prohibition. The same board had passed Pier Paolo Pasolini's The Canterbury Tales the previous year, a film containing content that the board had determined was protected by its literary source material. Themroc had no literary source material and received no such protection. The Italian board's distinction between acceptable and unacceptable explicit content was therefore not a distinction between content categories, but between cultural legitimacy frameworks, a distinction that Feraldo, who had made a film explicitly arguing that cultural legitimacy frameworks were instruments of social control, would have found entirely consistent with his thesis. Themroc has been released through various European distributors. Claude Feraldo made 4 more films before his death in 2014. Michel Piccoli continued working in French cinema until his death in 2020, and never cited Themroc among his significant work in any major interview, which is either a statement about the film's place in his career or a statement about the interview contexts in which the question was never asked. Themroc rejected civilization's language and found that the rejection was the argument. Emmanuelle in America kept civilization's language and its visual grammar and used both to deliver content that the regulatory systems of multiple countries found the glossy packaging made more rather than less threatening, because the glossy packaging made the content accessible to audiences the regulatory system had not anticipated.
Студиоканал представляет Лаура Гибсон.
And I see myself.
Okay.
Emmanuelle in America, 1977, directed by Joe D'Amato. Laura Gemser plays Emmanuelle. Not the Emmanuelle of Just Jakin's 1974 film, but a separate character using the same name under a licensing arrangement that the Italian exploitation market had determined was commercially viable. Working as a photojournalist who documents sexual subcultures across Europe and America and encounters, in the film's final act, actual footage that Joe D'Amato had not staged. Joe D'Amato made Emmanuelle in America for Crystal Film and released it through the Italian distribution network before it entered international markets through the regional deals that were moving Italian exploitation content across borders in 1977. The film belongs to the specific category of D'Amato's work that uses a commercially established character and format as a delivery mechanism for content that would not have achieved mainstream distribution under any other framing, the Emmanuelle name providing the cover that the content itself could not have generated. Laura Gemser plays the character across a series of sequences that the production's Italian locations, American location footage, and studio work combined into a film whose tonal range, from softcore to hardcore to genuinely disturbing, the Emmanuelle framework was specifically not designed to contain. The film was banned in the United Kingdom, Australia, and several other markets based on the hardcore sequences in the film's second half. Sequences whose presence within a film marketed as softcore erotica, the censorship boards found more objectionable than equivalent content in productions that had not disguised their nature. The shock element. The film's final act contains footage that D'Amato sourced from actual underground snuff film networks operating in the United States in the mid-1970s. Not staged simulations but footage whose provenance D'Amato has never fully documented in any interview. The footage was presented within the film's fictional framework as material that Emmanuelle discovers during her investigation. Whether the footage depicted actual deaths or extremely sophisticated simulations has never been officially determined. The FBI was reportedly made aware of the footage's existence in the context of the broader snuff film investigations of the period. No prosecution resulted. Emmanuelle in America has been released through various home video labels in versions that vary significantly by territory. Joe D'Amato made over 200 films. Laura Gemser played Emmanuelle in 11 productions. The footage in the film's final act has been discussed in academic writing about extreme cinema without producing critical consensus about its nature. The Image 1975, directed by Radley Metzger. A Parisian man named Jean encounters his former lover Anne at a party, and Anne introduces him to Claire, a young woman whose relationship to Anne the film presents as one of complete submission, and whose transfer of that submission to Jean the film documents across 90 minutes, with the specific formal patience of a director who had decided that the most disturbing version of the subject was the version that refused to editorialize about it. Radley Metzger made the image from Jean de Berg's 1956 French novel under the pseudonym Henry Paris, a production identity he had developed specifically for content that his mainstream arthouse distribution company Audubon Films could not handle under his own name. The film was shot in Paris and New York with a cast of professional performers and a production budget that Metzger's previous work in sophisticated erotica had provided the infrastructure to support. The image arrived in the American market through the adult theater circuit that had developed in the early 1970s as the primary exhibition infrastructure for explicit content, a circuit that the Attorney General's Commission on Obscenity and Pornography had been monitoring since 1970, and that local prosecutors in multiple American states had been using obscenity statutes to dismantle since the Miller v. California decision in 1973 had given those statutes constitutional grounding. The film was seized by law enforcement in Ohio, Georgia, and several other states under obscenity proceedings that Metzger contested with varying success depending on the jurisdiction. The shock element, Jean de Berg, the pseudonymous author of the novel the image had adapted, was revealed in 1990 to be Catherine Rob Grillet, wife of the French Nouveau Roman novelist Alain Rob Grillet. She had written the novel in 1956 under a pseudonym at the request of her publisher, who had determined that the content would destroy a female author's literary reputation if published under her real name. Pauline Arage, the pseudonymous author of the story of O, which appears earlier on tonight's list, wrote the preface to the original French edition of the image. Two of the most significant works of erotic literature in French publishing history were written by women, published under male or gender-neutral pseudonyms, and spent decades being discussed as anonymous or male-authored texts. The censorship systems that prosecuted both works never engaged with this specific irony. The image has been released through Cult Epics in a restoration. Radley Metzger continued working under both his own name and the Henry Paris pseudonym until his retirement. The Ohio and Georgia obscenity prosecutions were eventually dismissed. Catherine Rob Grillet published subsequent works under her own name and died in 2017. The specific legal reasoning that produced the seizures in multiple American states has never been formally revisited by any of the jurisdictions involved. The image was seized by American law enforcement for content that its author had concealed her identity to produce. The Canterbury Tales was prosecuted by the Italian government for content that its director had produced under his own name in public as part of a deliberate confrontation with the state that he had been conducting for his entire career, and that the state finally ended not through the legal system, but through a murder that has never been officially solved. The Canterbury Tales, 1972, directed by Pier Paolo Pasolini, Geoffrey Chaucer's 14th century collection of stories, The Miller's Tale, The Merchant's Tale, The Wife of Bath's Tale and others, adapted by Pier Paolo Pasolini as the second entry in his trilogy of life, shot in England with a cast that included Tom Baker and Hugh Griffith, and prosecuted by the Italian Public Prosecutor's Office for obscenity, before its domestic theatrical run had completed. Pasolini had been prosecuted by Italian courts before the Canterbury Tales, for his debut feature Acatone in 1961, for Mamma Roma in 1962, for The Gospel According to St. Matthew in 1964, for Teorema in 1968. Each prosecution had ended in acquittal. The Canterbury Tales generated a fourth prosecution, which also ended in acquittal. The pattern was not coincidental. Pasolini was conducting a sustained argument with the Italian state through his filmmaking, and the state was responding through the legal system it had available, and neither party had yet found the instrument adequate to the confrontation. The Canterbury Tales specifically drew prosecution for the sequence, depicting hell as a place where corrupt clergymen are subjected to the punishments Dante had reserved for sinners, a sequence whose specific content the prosecutor cited as obscene, and whose specific content Pasolini cited as a direct quotation from the medieval tradition the film was adapting, which is the specific argument that produced the acquittal. The shock element is not in the legal proceedings but in what followed them. Pasolini completed the trilogy of life with Arabian Nights in 1974, and immediately began work on Salo, or the 120 Days of Sodom, a film so extreme that he subsequently renounced the entire trilogy of life, stating in his final interviews that the sexual liberation the trilogy had celebrated had been absorbed and neutralized by consumer capitalism, and that Salo was his response to that neutralization. He delivered Salo to his producers in October 1975. On the night of November 1st to 2nd, 1975, he was found dead on a beach near Ostia outside Rome. He had been beaten with a wooden plank and run over by his own car. A 17-year-old named Giuseppe Pelosi was convicted of the murder. Pelosi subsequently recanted his confession and claimed he had been one of multiple attackers. The Italian courts have never formally reopened the investigation. The murder of the most prosecuted filmmaker in Italian cinema history remains officially unsolved. The Canterbury Tales has been released through Criterion as part of the complete trilogy of life restoration. Pasolini's final interview, given 2 weeks before his death, contains his complete statement on why he had renounced the trilogy. The beach near Ostia where he was found is accessible. The wooden plank used in the attack was never officially identified. Giuseppe Pelosi died in 2015, maintaining that he had not acted alone. Censorship boards, police seizures, community disruption, studio cuts, and in the final case, something that required no legal instrument at all. What connects them is not the content. It is the specific threat the content posed to the specific institution doing the suppressing. The case is still open. Nobody has been held fully accountable. Leave it in the comments. I want the specific reasoning, not just the conclusion. Like. If Pasolini's name was new to you today, subscribe. Next time we go into the films that were banned not by governments, but by the studios that made them, and the specific financial reasons. Those suppressions lasted longer than any court order ever did.